everyone. I'm Jill Dossie. I'm Senior Curator here at MCASD. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for this book reading and signing with San Diego-based author Leah Ollman in celebration of her beautiful new book, Ensnaring the Moment, on the intersection of poetry and photography. This occasion is even more special because we will hear from renowned poet Rae Armantrout, Professor Emerita at UC San Diego. Ullman and Armantrout will be in conversation, and although Armantrout is based in the Seattle area now, she grew up in San Diego and taught in San Diego, so I am pleased to welcome two of our hometown heroes. This event is presented in conjunction with Alex Katz Theater and Dance, which I encourage everyone to see if you haven't already. Katz was a painter, but he found affinities with poets at a moment in the 1950s when visual artists and poets were both embracing vernacular expressions. And you'll be hearing from Leah soon, but I'll briefly say that Ensnaring the Moment is an anthology of poems from the late 19th century to the present that reckon with the impact of photographs on our individual and collective consciousness. And we'll be hearing Leah tonight read from her introductory essay. Let me tell you a bit about her. Leah Ollman has been writing about art for more than 35 years. Her reviews and features have appeared regularly in the Los Angeles Times and Art in America, as well as in Photograph, the Brooklyn Rail, Paris Review Daily, Contemporary Art Review Los Angeles, which is Carla, Art News, American Craft, and many other publications. She has written essays for books on William Kentridge, Alison Rossiter, Julie Blackman, Michael Light, Chris McCaw, Clea McKenna, and others. And she has also contributed to numerous exhibition catalogs. Since 2018, she has served annually as a judge for the James Beard Awards. She earned her MA, her Master's in Art History, from the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University, and graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Scripps College. Her book, Ensnaring the Moment, on the intersection of poetry and photography, was released by St. Lucie Books in 2025. Yay. Rae Armantrout, I think many of us have been looking forward to this book for many years. Rae Armantrout has published 17 books of poetry. Her most recent is Go Figure, published by Wesleyan University Press in 2014. Her 2018 book, Wobble, was a finalist for the National Book Award. In 2010, Verst won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. And I just finished reading True, which describes Armantrout's childhood in East County, San Diego. Recommend. Armantrout is Professor Emerita at UCSD. Her poems have appeared in journals such as the Paris Review, the New Yorker, Baum, Granta, and Poetry Magazine. So with that, please help me welcome Leah Ollman and Rae Armantrout.
Thank you all so much for coming. See a lot of wonderful familiar faces, and I'm really appreciative. Thank you, many thanks to the museum team for hosting us, Anna, Patrick, and especially Jill for the invitation and the gracious introduction. I'm very honored to have Rae Armantrout joining me tonight. I've been a long-time reader of Rae's work, and I did the annoying thing a few years ago when Rae was doing a reading at the San Diego Festival of Books at USD. The annoying thing being standing patiently in the book signing line until I got to the front, and then when I got to the front, talked all about my project, which was this book I didn't have a publisher for yet. But Rae was incredibly gracious and generous with her time and attention and encouraged conversation, and I'm very grateful that she was as kind as she was, and here we are today, 3 years later. So thank you.
Thank you.
So I want to start by telling you a little about how this book came about. The book had two very clear origin points, and the first announced itself in the course of my work writing about art. And a lot of that work involved writing about photography, reviews of shows, features on artists. because photography is one of my particular interests and an ever-evolving practice that I'm fascinated by. And I remember one day, very vividly, about 10, maybe 12 years ago, I was in a gallery in Hollywood that had a photography show that I was going to review for the LA Times. I was looking at the show and making notes as usual, and writing down my thoughts and observations. And I remember writing down the word poetic and just freezing, because I realized I didn't actually know what I meant by that, but that I had been reaching for that word over and over again, especially in regard to photographs. And it had become, I feared it had become a lazy shorthand. So I declared a moratorium on its use until I could understand a little better what I meant. I sensed that there was something there, but I wasn't at all clear what it was. I'm also a regular recreational user of poetry. And the book's other originating event happened in the course of my reading. I read daily with enthusiasm, but with no real structure or scholarly guide. And mostly I'm reading it for the feel of the language and for the way poetry enters the mind and body through channels very much its own. So around the same time that I experienced that jolt in the Hollywood gallery, I read a poem by Adrienne Rich that gave me another jolt. Part of the poem ended up serving as the epigraph for this book. And that section reads, "Today, a fresh, clean morning, your camera stabs me unawares right in my mortal part. A womb of celluloid already contains my dotage and my total absence." I read that poem, especially that section of the poem, and marveled at how much it said about the nature of photography, about how a photograph prolongs the presence of a subject and at the very same time amplifies that subject's absence. That passage seemed to me to capture something profound and very true about how photography engages with time, specifically how it messes with time. In my everyday reading, I'd come across a lot of poems that had addressed photographs or the photographic, and at that point I started collecting them more purposefully and organizing them in a database. Sometimes a poem I read addressed a single particular photograph, a found photograph or a family picture. Sometimes I recognized what that picture was because it had been in the news and had entered collective consciousness that way, or it was a picture that was canonical in photo history. Sometimes a poem borrowed the terminology of photography, using words like shutter, exposure, aperture, to talk about something that wasn't photographic at all. The language of photography was being used metaphorically. When I read these poems, I had a feeling related to the one I had in that Hollywood gallery, where I felt I needed to stop and take what I was encountering into deeper consideration. Again, I sensed that something connected poetry and photography, but I really wasn't sure what. And I wanted to follow that thread and pursue it. So I read and I read and I speculated on the nature of the photographic and the nature of the poetic. I explored what I felt were the affinities between the two media, the impulses that poetry and photography share to compress time and distill experience, and also the underlying fundamental link they both have to memory and to the preservation of a moment. During this process, I felt a bit like an explorer in territory that had not been well charted. And it turned out this terrain where poetry and photography meet is vast and full of surprises. So I came to think of what I was doing as making travel notes and putting together a personal field guide that might be accessible to others with my own highlights and curiosities and points of interest. The project took a variety of shapes over all those years until ultimately it took this shape. And as Jill said, Ensnaring the Moment is an anthology of 112 poems, one each by 112 poets, spanning more than 100 years. The selection of poems is entirely personal. There really isn't a way to compile a comprehensive anthology of poems on this theme, so that was not my aspiration. I chose these poems from the ones I had collected, and this database now has more than 600 poems in it, and I could add another one every day. But I chose these because they resonated with me, they provoked me, they just were poems that didn't let me go. Each one represents a kind of reckoning with an image, or the memory of an image, sometimes the making of a photograph, sometimes the intentional not making of a photograph. And because of their incredible forms and approaches to language and ideas, these poems induce a reckoning in me as a reader, and especially as a writer, who is always negotiating between the verbal and the visual. At some point in the process of collecting poems and thinking through why they felt so relevant to me, I realized that it was because these poets are doing a variant of what I've done all my professional life, which is responding to visual experience through language. I am not a poet by any means, but I could feel that these poems and my work writing about art operate on the same continuum. There's two questions that come up repeatedly since the book has come out, so I thought I would just answer them preemptively. One of them has to do with how the poems in the book are organized. When I was working on compiling the final set of poems to include and securing permission to reprint each one of them, I kept the poems in a printed out stack, organized alphabetically by the poet's last name. I would go through them over and over, kind of in a curatorial way, trying to figure out what would be the best thematic organization, what kind of through lines I wanted to accentuate, ways to make little groupings or constellations of poems that had shared traits or affinities. And ultimately, kind of surprisingly, I realized how much I liked the order as it was, alphabetical, because it's so unforced. And there are a lot of common themes and ideas that recur throughout the selection of poems, but having them sequenced this way allows you, as a reader, to find those things, discover them independently and organically. I also have learned, now that the book's been out in people's hands for a little while, that most people don't read it front to back anyway, so they hop around and make their own order out of the selection. The other question, the one I probably get the most, has to do with the images in the book. Through the long process of working on this project, I was certain that I didn't want the book to have any photographs in it at all. I was, the chuckles they're just automatic. I felt strongly about this. I was adamant, even, because the poems are autonomous works. They're complete in themselves and self-contained. I didn't want to set up or reinforce that dynamic that can happen when text and image are presented together, when they're not expressly made to be seen together. One becomes sort of dominant and the other secondary or supportive. And the visual element usually claims primacy because culturally that's where our attention gravitates first these days. So I thought, no photographs. because I wanted to avoid that jostling for attention's top spot. But the idea of a book about photography, or centered on photography without any photographs in it, was a little hard for most people to comprehend. So the fabulous publisher of St. Lucie Books, Mark Alice Durant, came up with the idea of including evocative details of photographs to create a kind of photographic atmosphere that would aerate the text and create some breathing room. And so that's what we ended up doing, using mostly fragments of pictures from private collections. And I'm really happy with the way the text and image coexist. The photographs don't correspond directly to the poems, and there are no spreads where you see text and image at the same time. But the pictures are there to activate associations we all have with photography and to kind of prime you for the poems. In my introductory text to the book, I aimed also to kind of prime you for the poems and to situate them, to touch on some of the questions that propelled me along the way as I read and researched, and to offer some of the observations I made. So I'm going to read now a short part of that introduction. It starts like this. The poems in this collection open doors to photography. Front, side, back, trap. They offer a passage in and a tunnel through. They serve as verbal portals to the visual, where the visual itself is a portal to the past, to an unrecognized facet of the familiar, to the other, and to the self. Each poem here engages the medium of photography in a manner particular to the voice of its author and to its angle of approach. Together they articulate a rich roster of possibilities and still just some of the countless ways for poetry and photography to intersect. They manifest as well, striking affinities between the two media, common means and shared impulses, the contraction of time, the distillation and compression of experience, the preservation of a moment. Both photographs and poems engage the fugitive, the fleeting. Both extrapolate from the first-person act of witnessing. They both derive from discovery and recognition, typically within the plane of the everyday and familiar. Both are acts of pointing, of directing our attention. Photographs present what we may have already seen in some form, but the ramifications of which our functionally attuned sight didn't fully register. Photography is a matter of seeing through and above what we already see, just as poetry, in the words of C.D. Wright, is the language we cannot usually hear for always speaking prose. Poems concentrate language, set it to finer purpose, just as photographs train and tighten vision. I'm going to skip ahead a little. The poems here, among hundreds more, drew me in as rogue exemplars of writing about visual experience. They fit, here neatly, here loosely, into the tradition of ekphrastic poetry, but as an art historian and critic, I read them also as unfettered acts of criticism and lyric forays into photo theory. These poems are records of looking and of not being able to keep from looking. They are records of response to everything that looking breaks open. In their generous and merciless ways, the poems do what I have aspired to do over 3 decades of writing about what I see: whisper and scratch and sing a way in. I'm going to turn it over to Rae now, and I would invite her to read the poem of hers that's in the book, but I understand she might read something else first.
I'll read that second.
Okay, and after a while, we will go back and forth for a little bit and read a couple of other poems from the book that we've chosen. And we agreed to not disclose to each other in advance which poems we chose. Surprise ourselves. Maybe we'll ask questions of each other, and hopefully there'll be some time for you to ask some questions as well.
Well, the reason that I wanted to read this poem by Cynthia Cruz called Fragment first is that she, I think, is playing with and arguing against some of the language of the Imagist poets. The definition of poetry a famous definition that William Carlos Williams gave when he said a poem is a small or large machine made of words. So Cynthia starts with the word, I want this, I'm not looking, I may be misquoting, but I want this poem to be a machine. So she must have had Williams in mind. And the reason I say that is as I started to think about it, I realized that photography only became accessible to most people in the early 20th century when the Kodak camera first came out. And it became popular then, and only just a few years later, a handful of years later, the Imagist movement was born. And Ezra Pound coined the term Imagist poets. And their idea was that an image was, and this is according to Pound, an emotional, and again, I may not be quoting it quite correctly, an emotional and intellectual complex in a moment of time. And it's that in a moment of time that resonates with photography and the photograph. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I'm thinking now, for the first time, that maybe Imagism wouldn't have happened if Kodak cameras hadn't become available. And then I looked up the use of the word image to discuss poetry, critical discussion of poetry. And the word image wasn't much used at all before the Imagist movement. When the word image was used, it referred to a figure of speech. But it wasn't the self-sufficient image that we think of when we think of the image in poetry. And I think it's worth just mentioning Imagism in poetry because it's still very influential. It's not just a movement from 1912 to 1918. It's something that has influenced poets ever since, and especially, I think, poets of middle age or older have been, I don't know about the youngest generation, but American poets, middle-aged and older, are still very much influenced by Imagism. So, with that, I'm going to read the poem by Cynthia Cruz. I think she's maybe arguing a little bit with her influences here. We'll see. So it's called Fragment. I would like this poem to be a machine, concise, metallic, a counting apparatus, a means to keep each moment contained and fixed, akin to a series of Polaroids photographed and fixed to cardboard or some other paper panel backing, then photographed and affixed with Scotch tape to the wall, or a vitrine, a glass case within which to gather and collect each moment, each object representing each moment, a bundle, assemblage, or archive constructed of letters and notes, diary entries and fragments, articles and photographs torn from books, a machine that measures the space between the body and the mind, the dissonance that exists inside that moment, and there in that static, in the rip, the mar, the error between is where, when it begins, it will begin. So I have a few things to say about that poem besides the fact that it riffs off Williams. I noticed that in the beginning, the way that she describes these preserved moments in photographs, or this attempt to preserve moments in photographs, is not really very pleasant sounding. I mean, neither is the metallic counting apparatus. The idea that these moments are now contained and fixed, and what's more, affixed to cardboard or placed in a glass case, sounds, well, claustrophobic, right? It almost sounds sadistic. It sounds the way, it's something like the way dead insects are displayed, right? They're pinned up to cardboard or they can be kept in a glass case. So it almost seems like she's comparing these preserved moments to that. But she's not talking, meanwhile, about real photographs. The photographs are metaphoric. She's saying she wants her poem to do that. She wants the poem to do that, and yet she's ambivalent about it, to say the least, obviously. Until you get towards the end. And then there's a kind of shift in tone that's interesting. And the machine is no longer just preserving a moment that's static. The machine, the camera, the poem, is at that point measuring the space between the body and the mind, the dissonance that exists inside that moment. And I think that's some of what you were talking about in your introduction, that dissonance, because as soon as you set about to preserve a moment, you're also confronted with change and then with mortality, paradoxically. And so there's a dissonance that's inherent in photographs. And she gets to that, but it's the dissonance that she's really interested in. And I like it where she kind of lets go with the language and says, and there in that static, in the rip, the mar, the error, I hear the R's in all of those words. Between is where, when it begins, it will begin. And she doesn't say what it is. It may be the poem. I guess it's the poem. But she leaves room for it to be anything, really. Anything new is going to begin in that space of dissonance. And I like that.
I like looking at your book. Can you show everyone what that spread looks like? I didn't think I would love...
I destroyed books.
Yeah, it's pretty great.
I'm sorry.
It's lived in. It's really lived in. That's great. Yeah, I'm happy with you going ahead. You want to read?
Okay, I'll read my poem that's in the book.
Great.
And it's called Lasting. This was written shortly after my mother died some years ago. And it's in two parts. They're rather different. The second part is about a photograph. And the first part, well, you'll see, but basically it's about an empty house. Lasting. 1. Now light sits in the chairs, limbs the wooden filigree milled to indicate leisure. Perfect molecules of plastic sheet the seas. 2. When I remember my mother, I remember her fears, but in the photograph, she leans on a pillar, hands in pockets, head cocked, slightly amused. I guess, that what struck me about that photograph of my mother, just to get personal, is that I realized I didn't know the woman in the photo. She was young then. She was maybe 25 or something. She was being a little sexy, a little cocky, and, cocking her head and just looking directly at the camera in a sort of provocative way. And I didn't know her to be that way at all. And when I said I mostly remembered her fears, she seemed like a very anxious, worried, and kind of beaten down person. And I just thought, well, what happened to that girl? Where is she? Where was she? So that's one part of it. I think that, both sections are about deathliness, so to speak. And the one section that is really on a subject that seems to take a detour, the last stanza of the first section says, perfect molecules of plastic sheet the seas. And, I haven't read this poem for a long time, so when I looked at it, I went, how did I get to the sea? But then I was realizing that, the furniture was covered with plastic. And then with the word sheet, I mean, this didn't happen with us. We weren't such traditionalists, but I know that traditionally, a long time ago, they used to put sheets over mirrors in the homes of people who had died. And then, of course, we're all aware of how a big sheet of plastic is pretty much, killing the ocean gradually. So, images of death of different kinds, I think, come together in that first part. So this is a kind of poem of mourning, I suppose.
Thank you, Rae. I think a lot of the poems in the book that are about family photographs end up being mournful, or I think I used the word betrayal in my introduction, because the poets so often describe the experience of not recognizing this person that was either themselves or a person, their earlier self or parent or the whole family. It just really wasn't what they remembered at all.
Yeah.
So,
I noticed that as I read a lot of the poems in the book, of course, maybe all of them, looking for the ones I wanted to talk about, and I saw that over and over. Yeah.
I thought you were going to say I was looking for ones that were happy, but turns out there aren't so many of those. So speaking of that, I'm going to read one. This is a poem. I've started every reading so far with this poem because it was, in a way, kind of it's a gateway drug to this medium of, poems about photographs, because, I defy you to not be moved and shattered by this poem. This is called Tiny Siren by Sharon Olds. And had it been a year since I had stood looking down into the whirlpool in the laundry nook of our August rental, not sure what I was seeing, it looked like a girl brought up in a net with fish. It was a miniature woman in a bathing suit, lying back after the spin cycle, the photograph of a woman, slightly shaped over the contours of a damp towel. I drew it out, radiant square from some other world, maybe the daughter of the owners of the house, and yet it looked like someone we knew. I said to my husband, "This was in with the sheets and towels." "Good heavens," he said, "where?" "In with the sheets and your running shorts. Doesn't it look like your colleague?" We gazed at the smile and the older, shapely body in its gleaming rainbow sheath, surprised trout of wash day. An hour later, he found me and told me she had given him the picture the day that they went running together when I was away. He must have slipped it in his pocket. He was so shocked to see it again, he did not know what to say. In a novel, I said, this would be when the wife should worry. Is there even the slightest reason to worry? He smiled at me and took my hand and turned to me and said, it seemed not by rote, but as if it were a physical law of the earth, "I love you." And we made love, and I felt so close to him. I had not known he knew how to lie, and his telling me touched my heart. Just once, later in the day, I felt a touch seasick, as if a deck were tilting under me. A run he'd taken, not mentioned in our home, a fisher of men in the washing machine. Just for a few minutes, I had felt a little nervous.
Yeah.
Like a number of other poems in the book, this poem traces this arc from a state of innocence to a state of knowing, but in this case, she doesn't want to own that knowing. It's also one of several poems in the book that recall the fallout from finding a photograph, usually at home, in some surprising place. And that discovery shatters the status quo and just defies all the assumptions of everyday life. And it serves as a warning sign and as evidence, and it's disruptive. And it's not the cause of the disruption, but its visibility and tangibility make the actual disruption irrefutable. So it plays into that whole photograph as evidence thing as well. That problematic aspect of photograph as evidence.
Well, I think the next poem I'm going to read is pretty devastating too, and it's not a word in my usual vocabulary, but you'll probably recognize the photograph that this poem describes, because we've all seen it. So I won't tease you with it, I'll just say what it is so that I can try to say the name. It's the famous photo of that 9-year-old girl who was burned with napalm in the Vietnam War. And her name, it turns out, and I don't know if I should even try to say this because I don't know how to say this name, but John Tai Kim Phuc. Running naked after being severely burned. So here's the poem. And I mean, you know, a poem about this might be impactful no matter how it was written, but I think the way this poem is written, the way it delivers the information and the way it ends, just, you know, it's gonna have an impact on you. War photograph by Kate Daniels. A naked child is running along the path toward us, her arms stretched out, her mouth open, the world turned to trash behind her. She is running from the smoke and the soldiers, from the bodies of her mother and little sister thrown down into a ditch, from the blown-up bamboo hut, from the melted pots and pans. And she is also running from the gods who have changed the sky to fire and puddled the earth with skin and blood. She is running, my God, to us, 10,000 miles away, reading the caption beneath her picture in a weekly magazine all over the country. We're feeling sorry for her and being appalled at the war being fought in the other world. She keeps on running, you know, after the shutter of the camera clicks. She's running to us, for how can she know, her feet beating a path on another continent? How can she know what we really are? From her distance, we look so terribly human. I know, whoa. So, I mean, what do you say about that? The first line that really struck me was, the first part is just straightforward description of the photo, but when it says the world turned to trash behind her, that was striking. Instead of turned to ash, it's turned to trash, as if, you know, now her world is no longer valuable. You know, you can drop fire on it from the air, turn it to trash. She is also running from the gods, that got to me, who have changed the sky to fire. I mean, how would a child understand what was happening? And then, in the middle, she is running, my God, to us. And of course, it would look that way, you know. I mean, we're looking at her and it looks as if she's looking back. You know, she's looking straight at the camera, so it looks as if she's looking at us. And, you know, the people who saw the photo, who see the photo now, are appalled at the war, but not appalled enough, of course. It's fought in the other world, it says here. But really, of course, there is no other world. There's just this world. But this, I think, is relevant to what we've been talking about. She keeps on running, you know, after the shutter of the camera clicks. So the captured moment is not the whole truth of the situation by any means. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, there are a couple of other poems in the book that deal a little, not similarly, but they deal with that internalizing of a horrifying image and horrifying truth of a situation. There's Elizabeth Bishop poem, which isn't really about horror, but it's about recognizing a kind of shared humanity that's very jarring to a child. There's the Kenneth Pitchford incredible poem, Color Photos of the Atrocities, that is very another devastating account of like, what do I do now that I've seen this? What do I do with myself? How do I go on now that I've seen this image?